the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to share with you one of my childhood games that I think has a lot of interesting moments and instructive material. Let's get started. Here we go. One of the main themes of this lesson will be the backward pawn. The pawn structures are typically the most defining part of a chess game, at least strategically speaking. Of course, tactics is always a priority if there are tactical opportunities to checkmate your opponent or to gain material. However, lack of that, when the game is just kind of developing, you're trying to make plans, typically the way you define your plans is based on the pawn structure, how the pawns are positioned in the game. Well, let's get started with the game, where I had the white pieces and played e4, my opponent responding with e5, knight f3 developing, knight c6, and here I played d4. This is the Scotch opening. Well, let me mention a couple of things here. Beginner players often like to give this check with a bishop. For them, I'd like to say that that's almost always a bad choice, assuming that the other side is able to block with the pawn, like this. Why? Because now black needs to waste time in moving the bishop a second time. The bishop will need to move. In this case, we'll need to move back to d6, protecting a second time black's pawn on e5, and the bishop is kind of unfortunate looking on d6 in view that it blocks the d7 pawn's advancement, which in turn locks in the bishop on c8. So therefore, forget about those check ideas. In general, giving a check to your opponent in itself, it means nothing. It's not an accomplishment. In addition to the game move, the only other move that makes somewhat sense is to play d6, protecting the pawn on e5. I have to say I had countless games with this position, although white is somewhat better, and typically I would continue by playing bishop to b5, pinning my opponent's knight. In the actual game, in this position, my opponent traded on d4, which is clearly the best choice. In almost all my games, when I reach this position, I would recapture here with a knight, as I did in this game. Although, for the more adventurous types, I'd like to mention that there is the so-called Scotch gambit also, where white would sacrifice a pawn or two in order to develop quickly and open files and diagonals for their pieces. That game could possibly develop in such direction. As you can see right now, the two white bishops are pasting towards black's king side, and therefore black faces some challenges. That's not to say that it's a winning line for white, but it's certainly interesting and leads to a very dynamic and sharp game. Going back to this position, I played in a more conservative and solid way by recapturing with my knight. And this is a crossroad in this opening. Black here has a good number of decent moves. Two of the main moves are to play bishop c5, developing, or the other one being playing knight f6. Both normal, regular developing moves. In addition to them, again, the more adventurous ones tried queen h4, which typically is not a good idea to bring your queen out early. However, theory so far has not refuted this move in this particular position. As we know, there are always exceptions to the general rules. My opponent didn't choose any of those three common moves, but played a move that is not uncommon on a club level. However, it is not a good move. My opponent traded the knights, and I recaptured. Well, some people would think that with this last exchange of knights, Black forced the white queen out prematurely. And this is why chess is such a difficult and complex game. Because yes, I tell you one thing, such as do not bring out your queen early, and yet I do it myself, and there are situations that are exceptions to the rule. And that's the hard part, to know when you should look for the rule and when you should look for the exception. Well, for beginner intermediate players, I typically recommend that you better off follow the rule in general. However, you need to have your priorities straight, namely that capturing a knight generally comes ahead in the rank of priorities compared to strategical advantages or disadvantages. Having your queen out early is a strategical issue. Winning a knight 99.9% of the times comes ahead of such or other strategical issues. And the only thing that would come even ahead of material, that is capturing a knight, for example, is the safety of the king. The other issue that is important in this position, that even though the white queen has developed early, Black no longer has a knight on b8, which in turn could jump out to c6 attacking white's queen. Therefore, the white queen is in a relative safety. Let's examine Black's most natural move, knight f6. Typically, this would be an excellent developing move. Not here though, because in this situation, White would be able to advance the e-pawn to e5, immediately attack Black's developed knight to f6, because the important point here is that the Black knight cannot go to any of the center squares on d5 or e4. An important pattern to remember is that when a knight moves to h5, oftentimes it gets stuck and gets trapped after a move like g4. It's true that here temporarily Black can save the knight by pinning White's pawn. However, White would simply protect the queen and then again renew the threat of capturing the knight. Black would be in serious trouble here. Going back to the position after e5, Black's relatively best move is to retreat the knight to g8. However, that's clearly not a good thing, moving backwards. However, relatively it's better than moving the knight to h5 or any of the other places where the knight would be lost immediately. Again, you typically rather choose a strategical disadvantage compared to losing material. The actual game, after the exchange of knights on d4, continued by Black playing c5. See, Black is trying to attack the queen. However, here that's certainly not a good choice. You have to be extremely careful with moving your pawns. As you know, pawns are the only pieces that do not move backwards. This move, c5, actually is a major mistake. Why is that? Because it clearly weakens Black's pawn on the d file. Pawns that are on open files, which therefore can become easily a target of attack, become especially weak when they no longer have the potential to get the protection of another pawn, which is the case here. This type of pawns, like the d7 right now, would be called a backward pawn, because the c-pawn can no longer ever protect that pawn, and obviously Black has no pawn on the e-file. Another important component to this picture is that white has a pawn on e4 controlling the advancement of the d-pawn, and therefore black will have serious difficulties to get rid of his d-pawn. Right now, there are many good choices. I chose one of them by retreating the queen. Another move, not bad, would be to play queen e5. Right now, black would have to be careful not to lose a pawn, because if black would block with the bishop, the g7 pawn becomes unprotected, or if black blocks the check with the knight, then the pawn on c5 would fall. Therefore, that will leave black only with one option, and that is to block with the queen. That's relatively the best move. However, in that case also, white would maintain a strategical advantage, either by protecting the queen with bishop f4 or exchanging queens. Again, black's problem would be, in either case, the weak d7 pawn, which could be targeted by white's rooks and other pieces. In the game, which by the way I played many years ago, when I was only about 7 years old, I retreated my queen to d1. My opponent responded with a natural move, playing d6, trying to open up the diagonal of the bishop on c8, and I continued with developing my knight to c3. A very crucial point in this game is the d5 square. I want to make sure I have full control of that square, making sure my opponent will not have the opportunity in the future to advance his d6 weakness to d5 and then try to exchange that weak pawn for my beautiful and healthy middle pawn on e4. After knight c3, the response was bishop to e7. And now I played bishop to c4. Again, continuing to develop, getting ready to castle, and putting further pressure on the d5 square. So step number 1 is making sure the weakness remains where it is, doesn't disappear. And then plan number 2 is to make sure we directly target the weakness, in this case the d6 pawn. Another alternative instead was to play bishop b5 check, in which case black would only have two semi-decent choices. One would be to move the king out of the check, which is not a great choice because actually it would give up the right to castle for the rest of the game. The only other option is to block the check with the bishop, in which case white could happily exchange the light-squared bishops, which would further increase white's advantage. I chose bishop c4 in this game, and my opponent continued developing with the knight. And first things first, I castled, and so did my opponent. So now this first stage of the game is pretty much over, the opening stage. Now white needs to have a plan, and the plan is very, very clear. Black has a target, and for the reason that black has a weakness and white doesn't, white now has a clear advantage. Well, we didn't complete development yet, and therefore the next move is very logical, to develop our bishop from c1. The question is, where to? Well, it's typically quite efficient if you can combine your own goals of defensive nature as well as with offensive. So in this case, on one hand, we just want to develop our pieces, and at the same time, you can develop it to a square where it immediately targets the opponent's weakest point, which is, in this case, the d6 pawn. And my opponent responded with bishop e6. There are a bunch of pleasant choices in this position. Probably the least attractive one is to exchange the bishops because that would help black to consolidate to gain control of the d5 square, and then on the following move black would hope to play d5. If you're already in this situation, then white's best option is to play e5 right now. Perhaps the simplest way to maintain white's advantage is to just protect the bishop on c4 with the queen from e2 or maybe even from d3. Also, playing knight d5 is a good alternative. Black could not win a pawn by playing knight e4 now, because white immediately would play rook e1, chasing the knight back where it came from, and then white would have the opportunity to trade and then win material with bishop takes d6. Going back to the game situation, I played bishop to d5. Just thinking back on the last variation, after if I would have played knight d5, of course, black by no means was forced to capture that pawn on e4. Bishop d5, and now the bishop from here attacks the pawn on b7, which explains my opponent's next move. However, let me point out something else that's important, namely that if bishop takes d5 right now, then it's important not to capture back with the pawn, because if I would now capture back with the pawn, that would mean that black's pawn on d6 no longer would be the weakness that we talked about earlier, because it's no longer on an open file, and therefore I would have serious difficulties in attacking it several more times. Therefore, my plan here would have been to capture back with the knight. When knight captures d5, then capture with the queen. We want to make sure we always end up having a piece other than a pawn on d5. Of course, it's based on the tactic that if now knight takes pawn on e4, then black would lose material after the skewer with queen e2. Now, if the black knight moves away, the black bishop falls, and black can only create a temporary protection of the knight, because then f3 comes and white comes out clearly ahead. My opponent's response was to play rook b8, protecting the pawn on b7. Also, in addition, perhaps thinking about playing b5 and b4 aggressively on his own end. Therefore, preventing any of those ideas, I played a4. My opponent traded bishops, and I took back with my knight. Of course, I prefer not to capture with my pawn. Again, it would be unsafe for black to capture the pawn because of queen e2, and after f5, again f3, and black is losing material. After knight e5, my opponent responded with rook e8. In this position, I could have won a pawn already by capturing my opponent's bishop with my knight and then the pawn on d6. Instead, I chose the inferior trade of knights on f6. First of all, now black had the option to avoid losing the pawn by capturing back with the pawn on g7. Although that looks rather dangerous because it opens up the G file against black's king. In addition to quickly bringing my queen and bishop to h5 and h6 respectively, after G takes, I would also seriously consider swinging my rook from the other side with rook a3 and then appearing on g3 or h3 real soon. So while the pawn recapture on f6 would avoid the immediate loss of material, it probably would result something even worse, a quick attack on the black king. My opponent, after knight takes, captured back with the bishop. And now bishop takes d6 wouldn't quite be as good as I would hope, because after the rook moves away, all of a sudden the rook from c8 protected the pawn on c5, while my pawns on e4 and b2 are still hanging. Instead, I traded on d6, captured a pawn, followed by exchange, and my opponent moved the rook out of harm's way, protecting the pawn on c5. Now, still, both my pawns on b2 and e4 are hanging. The best choice right now was to play rook a to e1, protecting my pawn, with the idea that after bishop b2, I would go back rook b1. Instead, I made a mistake by playing c3, which gave up my pawn on e4. I didn't give up fight though. I played rook e1 to gain control of the open e-file. Now black cannot double up, because then after the exchange of rooks on e4, the pawn on c5 would fall. Therefore, my opponent traded rooks. I recaptured and came b6. And now, as typical for endgames, it's time to bring the king, which I did. King f1. And my opponent started misplaying the endgame here by playing bishop g5, giving me time to play f4, bishop f6, and now an important move, bishop e7, in hopes to exchange the bishops and then get my rook to the 7th rank. My opponent responded with rook e8, inviting a transposition to a pawn endgame. That's always a risky endeavor, especially when you see a pawn structure as such. I immediately played king e2, trying to run towards a6 to attack the base of black's pawn chain. And here black made a big mistake. Instead of running with his king to protect it, which he could still achieve on time, he played f5, and then my king simply ran away and won the pawns. Well, an interesting game. Hope you learned some ideas from the mistakes my opponent and I made. And now let's see the jewel of the week. Here we go. In this position, black has the material advantage. However, thanks to the fortunate circumstances for white, white can win the game. As usual, I suggest you take your time, try to figure out this complex, beautiful endgame, and then come back and enjoy the solution. Here is the solution. Knight f7 check is the first move, king h7, and now bishop h3. The chase starts. If now the queen takes the bishop, white forks immediately with knight g5. Also, black has to be careful where he moves with the queen. The queen can only consider moving to squares where it guards the f5 square. Otherwise, the bishop appears there and checkmates. Queen b5, and now knight g5. If the king moves to h8, the winning move is simply protecting the pawn by h3, and the black queen would get in Zugzwang. Let's see what happens after king h6, which attacks the pawn on h5. Believe it or not, white simply protects it. Oh wow, but how about queen takes pawn now with a check? Well, that's okay. Just king g8, and now the checkmate threat with knight f7 is pretty much unavoidable. Very nice. For example, if instead of queen takes the pawn on b4, after bishop g4, black plays right now queen d3, then knight f7 check, king h7, and the beautiful quiet move bishop f3. Black has no safe checks. On the other hand, they cannot avoid, for example, after b5, bishop e4 followed by knight fork with knight g5. And finally, the main variation. If in this position black plays queen d5 right away, the method is very similar. Check, king h7, and again bishop f3 using the same forking ideas, followed by bishop e4 and then knight g5. Very elegant and shows the beautiful power of the knight, how it can fork so effectively. Thank you for listening and so long until next week.